So the topic for today is the case against monopoly. The case against monopoly. Now, before we go into the case against monopoly, there are a couple things we do need to point out about when monopolies are good. So let's remind ourselves, when are monopolies good? So when are monopolies actually good for us? Well, we've talked about one thing already. What was the thing we talked about? Case like local cable companies. That means monopolies are actually good. What do we call that? A natural monopoly. Good. So the case of natural monopolies. And remember, the case of natural monopolies, like our cable company, comes from the idea that bigger is better, right? And it's usually tied to fixed cost. Cable companies have this huge fixed cost, and if they can spread it out over more customers, that's better for you and me. That's going to lower average cost. So cable companies, electric utilities also have that kind of big fixed cost that they have to spread out over its customers. Spreading it out over more customers is good. So bigger electric utility plants are really better than a bunch of small ones. So first thing we've talked about when monopolies are good, the natural monopoly. But another thing that I do need to point out is that monopolies might be a good source of innovation. Monopolies might be a good source of innovation. I don't want to discount the innovation that comes from having some monopoly power. So let's think about a drug company. So think about the pharmaceutical companies, and they invent a new drug, and they're going to get a patent, right? And that patent is going to give them monopoly power. So the patent is going to create a monopoly. Now, guys, do you agree with me that without that monopoly power, does the firm have the incentive to invent a new drug? Guys, if you're not protected from competition, are you going to spend the money to invent a new drug? No. So think about it. The only reason I'm willing to invest money to find a new drug that might cure cancer is because if I discover that, I'm going to get a patent and I'm going to have monopoly power. If firms can immediately come in and compete with me and steal my idea, I'm not spending the money to try to create these new pharmaceutical products. So innovation comes from kind of being protected from your ideas being stolen by other people, right? From other companies. And so we don't want to discount the idea that monopolies can really be a source of innovation. But what you're going to see today is that there's a lot of things that we can say that make monopolies bad. And I want to remind you that we have regulations in place to protect us from monopolies. So some of you, if you're in legal environment of business, for example, have learned about antitrust laws. And those antitrust laws are in place to limit monopoly power. Because as we're going to see today, monopolists make things worse for you and me as consumers. So we don't eliminate all monopoly power, but when you cross a line, when we deem that you've gotten excessive monopoly power, we might do something to try to limit that. And so these antitrust laws give us a little protection. So you might remember the case against Microsoft. At one point, Microsoft was being investigated. Is Microsoft a monopoly? Well, that's what was being investigated. Well, if I have this right, I believe they determined that no, Microsoft didn't have enough monopoly power to deem it as a monopoly, right? So we didn't see them break up Microsoft into competing firms, whatever. But in history, we've seen examples. The telephone company was a monopoly. And historically, we went in and broke up the telephone company into competing firms so that there was competition. So we're going to spend today talking about the case against monopoly and why we might argue that monopolies are bad, understanding that sometimes they're good, natural monopolies, and that they are a source of innovation, and we want to acknowledge that. All right? So let's continue. let's start by looking at what would happen. So what would happen if we forced a monopolist to behave like a competitive firm? So what would happen if we forced a monopolist to behave like a competitive firm? So we're not going to break it up, but we're going to force it. Let's just say we can set a regulation that says, hey, you have to act like a competitive firm. So let's think about what that's going to mean. How do we behave when we're a competitive firm? So let's think about firms in perfect competition. And one thing that we learned last class period about firms in perfect competition is that they had no markup above their marginal cost, right? They didn't mark up price above marginal cost. And so we concluded, we looked at this graphically, and so you can go back to last lecture to take a look at this, but we concluded that firms are marginal cost pricers. And if you're a marginal cost pricer, then you are setting your price equal to marginal cost. So when we say we're going to force a monopolist to behave like it's a competitive firm, we're going to force it to be a marginal cost pricer. Everybody with me? Going to force it to be a marginal cost pricer. All right. So let's do that. Let's start with our monopolist graph and draw it big enough so you can see all the detail. And let's put in our downward sloping demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. And now let's put in our marginal cost curve. So let's start by thinking about if this firm behaves as a monopoly. Well, we already know what that means. If they behave as a monopoly, can we find output? Can we find output, everybody? All right, everyone agree that QM is the monopolist's output? And can we find price? Where do we go to get price, everyone? Up to the demand curve, good. So here's the monopolist's price and quantity. So let's make a note of that. Price equals PM and quantity equals QM. So if the firm behaves as a monopolist, we know where they're going to operate. But now let's compare that to if they behave competitively. And remember, that means we're a marginal cost pricer. Okay. Now, let's think about it. If we're a marginal cost pricer, we set price equal to marginal cost. Can we figure out where that would be on the graph? So I know where marginal cost is, right? That's got to be on our marginal cost curve. Where do I go to get price? Where do I go to get price, guys? What curve? Ah, the demand curve. So guys, if marginal cost curves give me marginal cost and demand curves give me price, then what point do I want to be at? To dangle a participle. What point do I want to be at? The point where what intersects what? Demand intersects marginal cost. Good. So let's make a note that this is the point where price equals marginal cost. And let's make a note because price comes from the demand curve. All right. So now we've got our output for the competitive firm. And can I find their price? Yeah, I just go over right here and I find the price. So we've got, if this firm behaves competitively, that their price will have to be price PC and their quantity will have to be QC. Everyone agree? So what can we conclude at this point? What do we see? We see two things. Number one, who sets the higher price? Yeah, the monopolist, right? So the monopolist price is greater than the competitive price. The monopolist is going to have a higher price. And the second thing that we see, who sets the higher output? Who sets a higher output, everyone? Ah, the competitive situation. So who sets the lower output? The monopolist. So the monopolist's output is actually less than the competitive output. So what can I conclude? The monopolist sets a higher price, and the monopolist produces less. So the monopolist sets a higher price and it produces less. So this is the idea, guys. The second thing is the idea of what we call contrived scarcity. They create this kind of artificial scarcity because they produce less than what would be produced in a competitive industry. So from just this slide right here, guys, can we summarize part of the case against a monopolist? Yeah. So what is on our list so far? They set a higher price. Is that good for you and me as consumers? So if as consumers, do we want our goods and services produced by a monopolist or do we want them produced by competitive firms? Yeah, we're better off with competitive firms. And the second thing, where are we going to have more goods and services produced? When we have competitive industries. Monopolists restrict output, and that's how they raise price, right? So neither of these things are good for you and me. Agree with that? Neither of these are good for you and me. So we're kind of adding to this case against monopolists that just doesn't seem like in our role as consumers, this is really what we want. We'd rather have more competition. So now let's look at this through a framework using producer and consumer surplus. And I know that this is something we haven't talked about for a few lectures, but you're going to have to go back and review this. So let's look at the impact on consumer and producer surplus. Okay. The impact on producer and consumer surplus. And we want to do the same thing. We're going to compare monopoly versus the firm acting competitively. So once again, we're going to let the monopolist act like a monopolist. Then we're going to look at what happens when the firm acts competitively. And we're going to compare them to see how consumer and producer surplus are affected. So to do this, we need a pretty good sized graph. So don't skimp, paper's cheap. You're going to need to get a number of things on here, okay? So downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve, marginal cost curve. All right. So again, we've got to label everything. So everyone take a second and label the monopoly output and the monopoly price. Make sure that you got it right. So monopoly output and monopoly price. Take a second and do that. So guys, see some of you flipping back. Hopefully by now, guys, you've got this down. You have to get this right. I can't impress upon you enough that if you can't find output, then you can't find total revenue. And that means then you've got economic profits wrong. Do you see how you're going to miss a number of questions? That should be very easy. So you've got to have these very basics down, okay? All right, so did everybody come to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost? And you set your monopolist output at QM. You went up to your demand curve and over to get the monopolist price. All right, now let's force the firm to behave competitively. So everyone find price and quantity if we require the firm to be a marginal cost pricer. So we just did this as well. So everyone label this and make sure that you can find this without having to flip back to your notes. So by now we need to really make sure we're understanding this. So find the price and quantity if the firm acted competitively. So if we're a marginal cost pricer, everyone agree? We're going to be right there at that purple intersection where marginal cost equals the demand curve. So that's going to be our price. I'm going to call this price PC and quantity QC. Okay. Now we're going to label these areas so that we can work with them. So let's call this area A. So the whole triangle A. Let's call this area B, the whole rectangle. Let's call this small triangle C. Let's call this area right here D, and we'll call this area E. All right. So let's start by looking at if the firm acts competitively. If the firm acts competitively, in other words, they are a marginal cost pricer. So if the firm acts competitively, and then we're going to look at what happens if we let them act as a monopoly. So let's start with consumer surplus. Now remember, guys, consumer surplus is the difference between what you're asked to pay, right? I'm asked to pay $10, and the difference between that and what I'm willing to pay. So I'm asked to pay $10, but I'm willing to pay $15, then I can calculate consumer surplus. So in the case of the firm acting competitively, let's do this in purple. If the firm's acting competitively, what will be the price to consumers, everyone? What's the price? PC. All right. So price PC, right? So price PC, and of course we have our demand curve. So the difference between price PC and the demand curve, what areas do those give me? Everyone agree? Consumer surplus is going to be A plus B plus C. A plus B plus C. All right? But what about producer surplus? So producer surplus, remember producer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between what you're going to be paid. What are firms going to be paid here? What are firms going to get when they sell their product? What price? Price PC, right? Firms are going to get price PC, but they need to cover their marginal cost, right? Remember, they need to cover their marginal cost. So the minimum that the firm's going to be willing to accept, right, is going to be their marginal cost. But in this case, they're getting price PC. Everybody with me there? So what is producer surplus? What do the producers get that's above and beyond marginal cost if they're acting competitively? What's the answer? What areas? D plus E. Everybody with me? Does that make sense? And remember, we want to remember in this case, output equals QC. So we're producing all the way up to QC.
So what you're producing is above marginal cost?
What you're producing is above marginal cost? I wouldn't state it that way. I would state that you're getting price PC. Your costs are defined by your marginal cost curve. So everything in between is gravy.
Producer surplus.
Producer surplus. That's what, all right, D plus E. All right. So everybody with me to that point? So now let's see what happens if the firm acts as a monopoly. So again, we understand as a monopoly, you've got to remember that they're only going to produce an output equal to QM. So that's important to remember. We're constrained by QM. We're only producing up to QM. So let's look at consumer surplus. Then we'll look at producer surplus. All right. So guys, as a monopolist, what price are you charging consumers?
PM.
Everyone agree? PM, right? So consumers now have to pay price PM. So consumer surplus, remember, is the difference between the price consumers pay and the demand curve, what they're willing to pay. So what do consumers get here? What area do they get? What's their consumer surplus? Area A, right? Area A. They only get area A. That makes sense, right? Monopolists have raised the price and lowered their output, and that takes away consumer surplus. Everyone agree? So notice what we've seen. We see that consumer surplus shrinks. Everyone agree with that? Consumer surplus is shrinking. Now let's look at producer surplus. What price is the firm going to get paid for their product? PM, right? So the firm is going to get PM, and they need to cover their marginal costs, but remember, they're only producing QM units. So can I determine what our producer surplus is? What's it going to be, everyone? B plus D. Good. So I can't really say that producer surplus shrinks. It kind of looks like on this graph, it looks like it's gotten bigger, right? Producer surplus looks a little bigger here. And that makes sense too, right? If you're a monopolist, that's good for you as a producer, right? We want to be a monopolist if we're the firm owner. We don't want monopolists as consumers. Okay. So do you agree that we've seen kind of some transfer here, right? Consumers used to have B, and now they don't have it. Producers have it. But I really want to focus on that consumers go from surplus ABC, and it shrinks down to only A. So we're clearly very worse off. Let's also take a look at total surplus. Total surplus. Now, by total surplus, I'm talking about the whole economic pie, which is going to equal consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So the whole economic pie here. If you're a monopoly, it's going to look very different than if it's a competitive situation. So if you're a monopoly, do you agree that consumer surplus is A and producer surplus is B plus D? But if it's a competitive situation, we've got consumer surplus of A plus B plus C and producer surplus of D plus E. So what's happened to the whole pie, guys? The pie has what? Shrunk. Everyone agree? So the economic pie has shrunk under monopoly. The economic pie has shrunk under monopoly. Has surplus disappeared, guys? Has surplus disappeared? See a bunch of you shaking your heads. Has surplus disappeared? Well, where did C go? What happened to C? Ah, disappeared. What about E? It disappeared too. So understand that we see areas C and areas E simply disappear with a monopoly. So we can shade that area in on the graph, right? Everyone agree that it's that triangle right there in yellow? What do we call that? Anyone remember from test 2? Ah, great. That's called the dead weight loss. We have a dead weight loss created. So let's talk about that dead weight loss for just a second. So are you seeing a little bit more about the case against monopoly? So before we talk about dead weight loss, we've already got, they have a higher price, they lower output, and they shrink the economic pie, right? So yeah, not looking like monopoly is going to be good for us. So let's talk about the dead weight loss for a second. Dead weight loss. And we abbreviate dead weight loss in case you see it somewhere else, DWL, dead weight loss. So the dead weight loss here is the idea that the economic pie shrinks under monopoly. We see area, what was it? We see areas C and E disappear. Now guys, remind me, who did area C belong to? Go back and look at your graph. Who did area C belong to? Yeah, so this belonged to consumers. And who did area E belong to? It belonged to producers. It belonged to producers, right? What's causing it? Let's talk about why. Why is this happening? So remember, we have to go back to the idea of contrived scarcity. It's coming from this idea of contrived scarcity. Remember the idea that monopolists produce less. Monopolists produce less. And it's important to understand that these units not produced are valued by society. It's not that we don't want them. If we don't want them, then that makes sense. It's not dead weight loss if we don't want them. But these units aren't being produced, and these are units that are valued by society. These are units where trades would be mutually beneficial. Trades would be mutually beneficial. But these exchanges don't take place. So these are trades that would make sense to have between producers and consumers, but they do not take place because of the idea of contrived scarcity. So let's make sure we have our little laundry list here. Our case against the monopolist, we've said that they increase price, right? We've said that they decrease quantity, and they decrease the size of the economic pie. So not looking like monopoly really works in our favor. And of course, that's why we have antitrust laws and we try to limit monopoly power. There are things that monopolies can do, innovate. Natural monopolies are good, but in general, we don't see a lot of examples of natural monopolies. So let's now take a look at one more thing that we can add to our case here, and that is what we call productive efficiency. Let's take a look at what we call productive efficiency. Productive efficiency. What we mean by productive efficiency, if you're a firm that is productively efficient, then you produce at the lowest possible average cost. You produce at the lowest possible average cost. And that's good for you and me, because when firms produce at the lowest possible average cost, then the firm can pass on a lower price to consumers. So we need to ask the question, does a monopoly behave this way? Do they behave in a manner that's productively efficient? So let's take a look. So let's draw our monopolist. With our downward sloping demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. And let's put in our marginal cost curve. And now I'm going to add an average total cost curve. All right, I'm going to add an average total cost curve. So again, we have to go back to find the monopoly's price and quantity. So everyone quickly find the monopolist price and quantity. Find the monopolist price and quantity. All right, so marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So here's the monopolist quantity. We go up to get price. So everyone has P and Q, right? Now I want you to find average total cost. Find average total cost and label it. So go up. Remember, don't change quantity on me. From QM, go up to the average cost curve and over. So everyone find average total cost. So you went up to the average total cost curve. And over. Average total cost. Everybody with me? Do I have it right? So we need to ask ourselves, is this firm at its lowest possible average total cost? Are they at the lowest possible average total cost, guys? No, where would the lowest cost be? The lowest possible average total cost would be at its minimum, right? The minimum is the lowest average total cost. Is that where this monopolist is going to operate? Are they going to be at their minimum? No. So we see that the firm is to the left of its minimum average total cost, which means they have a higher average total cost. Everyone agree with that statement? They're producing at a higher average total cost, yeah? So is this firm productively efficient? Is this monopolist productively efficient, folks? No, so it is not productively efficient. So we would say it's productively inefficient. So monopolists are productively inefficient. But let's do the same thing and see what the situation is for a competitive firm. So we're going to look in the model of perfect competition. So in the model of perfect competition, let's draw our graph. And what do I know about my demand curve here? What kind of demand curve do we have in perfect competition, guys? Horizontal, good. And remember, oops, demand, sorry. That's where also my marginal revenue curve is. Can I label my price? Do I know where price is? Yeah, because that's where my demand curve is. Okay, so demand, horizontal demand curve. And now let's put in our marginal cost curve. And now, I need to note one thing. This is a long run idea. I should have already said that, sorry. Doesn't really matter for monopoly. Short run can look like the long run for monopoly, right? Because there's no entry. But for competition, I need to note we need to be in the long run. So in the long run, we know we're at 0 economic profits. Everyone agree? For perfect competition? So I need to draw 0 economic profits, which means I need to have an average total cost curve that comes right down here like this. It touches down right on the demand curve. So I have 0 economic profits, remember, in the long run for perfect competition. So make sure you understand why I'm drawing it the way I'm drawing it. Okay, so can we now, for our graph of perfect competition, find output? Can I find output? What's the rule? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Everyone agree that marginal revenue equals marginal cost right there? Everyone agree? And of course, I know where price is. So what do you see here? Let's ask the same question. Is the firm at the lowest possible average total cost? Is it? Yes, the answer is yes. Everyone agree that the perfectly competitive firm is efficient. They are at the minimum of their average total cost. So they have the lowest average total cost possible, which means then they are productively efficient. So that's just one more thing that's good about perfect competition, but bad about monopoly. So we've really built a case against monopoly. And so hopefully you understand why we spend a lot of resources trying to monitor and regulate monopolies. All right, if you have any questions, watch the lecture or come see me.